Welcome new and old friends. My name is 242, and today 42 got us two stories. The first one is about something that watches you in the shadows, and the second is about a dog who joins a cult. So, turn off your lights, make sure your doors and windows are locked. Things are about to get spooky. I felt a single tear roll down my cheek as I placed the flowers on my ex-wife's grave and prepared to pay my respects. I sighed as I heard her screams, which were muffled by the layers of dirt, and I knew that I would have to return tomorrow with the flowers. It Watches You from the Shadows by Carrothill. All my life, I've enjoyed walking around outside late at night. As a teen, I'd sneak out at 1 or 2 in the morning and just walk around in the empty quiet, then rush home before dawn so my mom wouldn't wake up and find me gone. Most nights, nothing more than a nice walk would happen. Sometimes I see people coming or going in a hurry, off to who knows where. Once I caught a neighbor cheating on her husband and forgot to shut the blinds. Nothing out of the ordinary. As I grew older, my nighttime adventures would last longer and longer, with the freedom of being an adult and not having to be home by a certain time. This continued for years until the night of this story. I was living in Washington State, and I couldn't sleep. I tried to watch TV, but there was nothing on. I tried to wake up my girlfriend to talk or have fun. But once she's asleep, she's dead to the world. I hadn't gone walking in a long time, and this seemed like the best time for it. So, I got dressed, grabbed my phone and keys, and headed out into the misty, cool evening. Now, where I was living, after midnight, the town becomes pretty much dead. You have random streetlights every couple of blocks, the stoplights switch to blinking yellow at 2 a.m., and everything becomes eerily quiet. I was walking towards the river that ran through my town when I saw a couple of wolves a few blocks ahead of me. Wolves were no big thing. I've seen them along with deer, elk, and even a huge moose from my bedroom window just wandering around in the middle of the night. That night, however, there was something off about them. They looked scared. What scares a wolf? I know I don't want to find out, so I turned the corner and started heading in another direction, deciding to work my way around them and continue on towards the river. I made it past them and didn't see anything unusual on my way, and was soon at the park that lined the riverbank. Deciding to stop and rest for a bit, I sat down at a picnic table and watched the moonlight reflect off the water. It was very peaceful and quiet. The water was unnaturally still as the wind and the flow of the river make things move rather quickly. That on its own didn't bother me much. It was what I noticed then that bothered me. A cold chill came over me, not that unusual for Washington. But when it came to this damp, musty smell, like wet moss mixed with rotting wood and mushrooms. Wrenching at that smell, I looked around to see if something had died and was rotting nearby. Something you find with all the wild animals wandering about. But I couldn't spot anything. Deciding I needed some fresh air, I got up and decided to follow the boardwalk that ran along the length of the river. As I stepped onto the wooden platform, I noticed there was no noise. Now, this boardwalk would make a loud tapping noise or even creak in places where you stepped on it. But that night, it was dead silent. I looked down at my feet and hopped up and down a few times, but no sound. Feeling a little weirded out, I quickened my pace, deciding to hurry along the boardwalk to the bridge at the other end that crossed the river and entered the downtown area where there was a 24-hour grocery store. It was well lit, had someone working all the time, and would feel much safer than where I was just then. So I hurried along the boardwalk, not hearing any of my footsteps or anything from the river next to me, until I was close to the bridge. I could see it's about 3 blocks away when I heard a splash. The sound made me jump, I'll admit. After being almost dead silent for about 15 minutes, I stopped and looked around, but didn't see anything in the water. This part of the boardwalk bordered a section of the forest that the developers of my town decided to leave untouched. You had a river, boardwalk, the road, and then trees so thick you couldn't normally see through them. I say normally because as I turned to look to my right, I saw something moving in the trees. Whatever it was dark, big, hunched over, and it smelled. The same smell I had noticed earlier. Only this time, much stronger. I stopped. A stupid thing to do, I know, but I was curious. I turned to face the forest and watched this thing looking at me from the shadows. It stood there, hunched over, but if it were to stand upright, I would have guessed it was easily over 7 feet tall. I couldn't make out any features, just general shapes that stood there, watching me. I shook my head, thinking I might be imagining things, and looked away for a moment, then looked back, and the dark shape was closer. It was moving towards me. Now I know my fair share of legends and what might be in the woods in Washington. Bigfoot, Wendigo, you name it. And I knew that even if it was nothing more than a wild animal, any animal that comes that close to civilization without being scared off is dangerous. Not wanting to be caught by it, I rushed forward towards the bridge once more. It was a narrow bridge with a raised pedestrian platform only big enough for one person at a time to walk across. I knew that if I could reach that, it would slow it down if it continued to follow me. I ran towards the bridge, and I don't know if it was the fear in the moment, but I heard something chasing me. I didn't want to look back. I knew the forest ran the length of the road, only stopping once you reached the bridge itself. I needed to reach that bridge. So I sprinted the 3 blocks to that bridge, the charging sound behind me getting louder and louder until my feet hit the concrete platform and I could hear my footsteps again. I could hear everything again as a multitude of sounds invaded my ears. It was as if I had been inside a silent bubble with only a few sounds audible, only to plunge head first into a symphony of sound. Feeling safer on the bridge, I spun around to look behind me. I looked into the forest, and what I saw, I will never forget. The moonlight was brighter here, and for a moment, I saw something tall, thin, almost skeletal, and very dark glaring at me from the shadows of the trees. I watched as an inhuman face snarled at me and let out this odd whistling howl before it turned and sunk back into the forest. I continued on to that grocery store and waited inside until morning, then caught the 5:30 bus back to my part of town. When I got home, my girlfriend was still asleep. So I stripped off my sweaty, smelly clothes and took a shower. As I was showering, she woke up and stepped into the bathroom with me, asking me what had happened to my jacket. Pulling my head out of the shower, I asked her what she meant and then looked at my jacket in her hand. Running down the center of the back were 5 tears in the fabric, deep enough to rip through the outside and the fleece lining, but not the inner layer. Claw-like markings that were much bigger than a human hand. I told her what had happened, having decided not to keep it to myself after seeing that, and she looked very worried. She said there were legends of skinwalkers that used to be in the woods before the town was built, but no one had heard anything about them in years. This upset her enough that we moved a month later. Earth to Voyager 227. Do not return. I repeat, do not return. Nothing but static over the comms for 12 days. Then it returned. False alarm, Voyagers. You are clear to return home. My dog joined a cult. By Spooky Dude 43. I wish I never moved into the city. Don't get me wrong, it's nice to be closer to work, and there's so much more you can do here. In the countryside, it was a 15-minute drive to find someplace to eat, and a 30-minute drive to the nearest grocery store. Nothing was even open past 8 p.m. But here, I could leave work at 11 p.m. and find myself a movie theater or a restaurant right across the street. I was loving it. My dog, however, was less than thrilled. Shelby was a good girl, some sort of retriever. Almost golden, but not quite. Closer to a reddish brown. She had long, fluffy ears that would swing and sway as she ran, and a tail that would never stop wagging. But ever since we moved, she hasn't been the same. Eating less, sleeping more, signs enough for me to get worried. My concerns reached new heights when she started to run away. The first night she ran, I was belligerent. I wandered through the streets trying to call her name and explain to the officers on the phone what had happened at the same time. For 3 hours I searched, only returning home because it was dark, and the police had promised me that they would look for her. When I returned home that night and found her patiently waiting at the front door, I was not ashamed to admit I cried a little. There was no scolding, no anger. I was just happy to have her back. Then she ran away again. It became routine. Every week she would run away at least once, sometimes twice, only to return at my door a few hours later, waiting to be let inside. I scoured the house for any hole, crack, or crevice she could have been slipping out through, but found nothing. It was as if she was simply turning the lock and walking out, closing the door behind her. My friends recommended a shock collar to keep her in check, but I could never do that to her, though it did give me an idea. I fixed a little GPS to her collar, the kind they sell for keeping track of cats and dogs, and waited. It didn't take long for her to run away again, and I sat in my car prepared to follow her. I was stopped by a sudden realization. She's been happier, hasn't she? Ever since she started running away, her attitude has done a 180. She sleeps less, wags her tail more, and just seems to be in a generally better mood. I figured she just needed a chance to run around and stretch her legs, but I knew that sooner or later she would get hurt, so I started to follow the signal. As my car went from pleasantly lit streets to rolling down dark graveled alleyways, I started to sweat. What was she doing down here? I figured I'd find her at a park or someone else's yard bothering their cat. Not in some dark alley. Eventually, I reached a narrow path and had to get out of my car to travel it, shimmering past a rusty chain-link fence and into someone's backyard. Sat surrounded by tall brick walls was a little green lot, bushes and trees around the edge with a clear, unobstructed center. It was such an odd spot for a plot like this, like a tiny park wedged between buildings. The only way in or out was through that little chain fence. I peered past the bushes, and just beyond them in the center of the lot with 4 other dogs was my Shelby. I quickly pulled out my phone and took a few pictures. It was so cute to see my dog sneaking off to play with friends, like something out of a Pixar movie. I stood up, no longer trying to hide, and looked around the lot for anyone who might own the other dogs. There was no one else around, just me and the dogs. I stepped out of the bushes towards them and froze. Something was off. Shelby always jumps on me to greet me, but now she stood statue still, staring at me. All of them did, actually. Not a single one of them moved an inch other than their eyes, which followed me as I approached, just looking at me, heads low to the ground, tails stiff as stone. They looked like they should have been growling, but none of them made a sound. "Shelby?" I called hesitantly, but she didn't respond. I reached out to touch her, about to pat her head, but stopped myself. I felt so sure that if I touched her then, something would happen. My gut told me to leave, but I didn't want to go without my dog. "Shelby, come on," I pleaded, but she only stared at me. I left, squeezing past the fence, getting in my car and driving home. As I drove, I thought about what I should do. She'd be back, right? She always came back, always happy as can be. Would she be like that again, or would she be somehow she was in that alley? Maybe she just thought she was in trouble or didn't like that I found her secret spot. Though that wasn't like her. She would be fine once she came home, I decided. I just needed to wait. Hours rolled by at a snail's pace. I tried playing video games, reading, listening to music, anything to distract myself from my thoughts, but I couldn't stop worrying about Shelby. Each tick of the clock sounded like her nails on the concrete floor outside. Every bark had me checking out my window to see if it was her coming home. Finally, around 1 a.m. I fell asleep. In my dreams, I was in an alley again, walking towards the lot. It was dark out and I couldn't see past the fence. But as I got near, I could hear growling, and soon I saw 2 glowing yellow eyes staring at me from outside, slowly raising high and higher until whatever they belonged to stepped over the fence and began to come towards me. I sat up on the couch, rubbing my eyes and looking around my living room. It was still dark. A look at my phone told me it was 3:01 a.m., and I sighed, standing up and preparing to go to the bedroom when I heard something. My body went stiff, ears straining to catch the sound again, eyes wide as I slowly spun, searching the room for the source of the sound. It had sounded like an exhale, sharp, fast, and close. I nearly jumped out of my skin when someone pounded on the front door. "Who is it?" I called as I pressed my eye to the peephole, but I saw no one. and no one answered. I waited for a long time, listening hard and staring through that hole into the night outside, when finally someone knocked again. I didn't see their face or body, but what I did see is their hand raise up and strike the door 3 times.
I said, who is it?
I called again, more aggressive this time. Whoever was outside, I wanted them to think I wasn't some pushover. Hopefully they would leave me alone. They still didn't answer, but I began to hear movement outside the door, a scratching sound like nails scraping against concrete. And for a moment my eyes went wide. I dropped to my knees, pressing my cheek against the ground and checking under the door. There in front of me, sniffing hard like she just caught my scent, was my big reddish-brown snoot of a dog. My dog. I yanked the door open hard, arms already out and ready for Shelby to jump up into them. But there was nothing on the other side.
Shelby?
I called out in confusion, stepping outside, looking around, seeing nothing. There's no way I imagined that. It was right there. But I sighed, realizing just how tired I was, how sore my eyes were, and how desperately I needed sleep. I'll go back to the alley tomorrow. She'll turn up, I thought, trying not to think about her scared and alone, wandering the night looking for me, wondering why I hadn't found her yet. I couldn't sleep. Looking through old photos helped a little. It was nice to see her running through the fields of my old home. God, I miss it. I scrolled through every picture until I got to the most recent one, the picture of her and the other dogs. Smiling, I prepared to set it down when I noticed something strange. There was a sort of pattern to the grass. I thought I was imagining it at first, but the longer I looked, the clearer I saw it. It was like something was under the grass. The lawn seemed to bulge in lines that formed a circle around the dogs, with bits of building ground running between and around them in that circle. It was easy to write off as the natural bumpy dirt under the lawn, but something felt so deliberate about it. Have you ever seen those pictures online? The ones the artists write, the longer you look, the stranger it gets under? I felt like I was looking at one of those. Every time my eyes wandered, I noticed something else off about the picture. 2 birds in the trees I had missed before hung dead, bits of stringy rope tied around their feet to keep them suspended in the trees. The brick walls in the background seemed to have drawings carved into their surfaces. Between the dogs, half hidden in the grass, was something red and white. And finally, Shelby's eyes were a different color than their usual brown. They were yellow. A knock on the door nearly made me throw my phone. I sat up slowly. Something was weird about this knock. It sounded closer. It came again, louder this time, and I felt my body start to shake like my door had when they pounded on it. Someone was in my house, and they were knocking on my bedroom door. I slowly crept out of bed, preparing to run into the bathroom and call 911, when I heard a bark from the other side of the door. I rushed to open it, stepping out into my living room and looked around. Standing in the corner of the room, obscured in shadow, was what looked like a dog. "Shelby?" I asked, voice shaking with fear.
"Shelby."
It called back. Its voice was wobbly, pitched much too high, like it had to squeeze the words out. I froze in my tracks when it spoke, and could only stare in horror as it slowly stood up on its back legs and began to step towards me. It looked like something had taken my dog's skin and stretched it over its frame, but it wasn't a very good fit. Parts of its skin sagged and hung low, while other parts were too tight, starting to tear and seep blood, along with thin, dangling appendages. Its mouth hung open, and it seemed like its true face was watching me from inside. Parts of its body seemed to be moving under the skin, pushing against it, trying to pry through it. It towered over me, at least 7 feet tall, lowering its face inches from mine and sniffing at me a few times. Through Shelby's ajar mouth, I could see things moving, something wet and dark that seemed to be stretching out towards me, like a hand with 100 fingers all crawling along her throat. I stepped back and slammed my bedroom door in its face, turning the lock even though it didn't sound like it was trying to get in. It just kept saying her name, over and over, as I flung open my window and crawled out. The last thing I saw before I dropped to the ground was her snout, pressing under the doorframe and sniffing for me. I'm at my friend's house now. I ran to the nearest gas station and had her come pick me up. I didn't tell her much, just that something was in my house and I needed a place to stay for the night. She was understanding and didn't try to pry. I'm typing this up on her laptop because I don't want to forget or convince myself it didn't happen. I know what I saw, and I know something took Shelby from me. And tomorrow, I'm going back to that alley to find out what. After walking past that creepy church every day on my way to work, I finally figured out why the doors looked so weird. The locks were to keep people from getting out. Now don't panic, or 42 might bite. I know our video is coming to an end, but first I have a few things to say. As always, I would like to thank the writers who let me read their stories. These two gave me a very good chill as I read them. Now, if you agree and enjoyed this video and the stories, well, hit that like button and make sure it feels it. If you're new, I hope you will subscribe and turn that pretty little bell to all notifications. If you'd like to help this YouTube channel / podcast, just share it with anyone you think who might enjoy it. If you'd like to help in other ways, I have Patreon, merch, and PayPal. None of this is ever expected, but always appreciated. Now, let's get on to the Sunday word. Last week's word was panic, and it seems a few people got my reference to the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Thank you guys for your comments as always. Now this week's word is bizarre, which means very strange or unusual, especially so as to cause interest or amusement. So as always, either in the comments or on Twitter, write me a sentence using this word and you'll be in next week's video / photo. But as always guys, thank you for watching, listening, commenting, and subscribing. It's really awesome. Sleep tight and don't let 42 bite.